Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your patience and welcome to the Armory's first public program of 2022. My name is Tavi Anyongo, and I'm the new curator for public programs, and I am thrilled to be introducing and moderating this Sunday Salon, the first of a new series we have organized around the theme of making space at the Armory. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this salon is taking place on Lenapehoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenape people, and today home to one of the largest urban Native American indigenous populations in the United States. In making this acknowledgement, we recognize the history of dispossession and seek to forge new and sustainable relationships with indigenous nations in the spirit of decolonization and equitable futures. I also need to thank some of the many people who made this event possible. Rebecca Robertson for the invitation to make space at the Park Avenue Armory. Darian Suggs, who's out there somewhere, for ensuring the smoothest possible welcome to this magnificent space. And Maria Fernanda for joining the team at the 11th hour, hitting the ground running. Claire Marburg, Michael Lonergan, Jenny Bowman, and the entire assembly team have all worked overtime to make this event happen, for which they have my gratitude. I also want to give a shout out to two members of the Park Avenue Youth Corps, Jason Kispi and Zenebu Dia, for assisting today, as well as to our returning stage manager, Belinda Mbaye. A tremendous amount of work has gone into allowing us to gather together safely amidst an ongoing pandemic, notice the masks, and I want to begin by acknowledging all that labor. When I learned that the first artist for the 2022 Armory season would be Rashaad Newsome, I pinched myself. Here was an artist who has expanded the dynamic creativity of Black and Latinx queer ballroom like no other. Here was someone committed both to expanding his aesthetic and creating change for his community. If you have walked into the drill hall, you already know Newsome is a fearless, multidisciplinary artist, one who has explored the dynamic frequencies of Blackness in video, collage, sculpture, performance, artificial intelligence, the list goes on. How does he do it all? That's one question we could ask today. Perhaps one answer lies in his genius for being a conductor, or as Arthur Jaffa put it to me, a superconductor for the Black creativity he assembles. Newsome's capacious conduction of Black being, in other words, is not just about celebrating the latest technological advances. It is about Blackness as a kind of technology of creativity, to be sure, and of liberation. So, on our first panel today, we are lucky to have Rashaad himself in dialogue with eminent thinkers and artists who approach the question of envisioning Black freedom otherwise. Given this amazing panel and the breadth of work in assembly to discuss, there are many more issues than we could possibly cover in a single hour. So my job today is simply to kick things off and moderate our discussion. I'll ask questions of Rashaad and our esteemed guests, whose full bios are in your programs and on the website. They are, from nearest to farthest, from me, Rashaad Newsome, Amy Meredith Cox, Saidia V. Hartman, and Keon Williams. Please welcome everyone. We also have some participants who wish to be here today but could not. So in the spirit of Black temporal quantum entanglement, we will field reflections from Arthur Jaffa and Ruha Benjamin on the screen at a certain point in the conversation. In addition, the Black quantum futurists also wanted to be with us today, and there are several of their books available in the exhibition library, as well as on their website, blackquantumfuturism.com. They are also entangled in the web of co-conspirators and co-imaginers of assembly. We also want to hear from you, the audience. This event is being live streamed, so if you want to ask a question, please fill out the note card on your seat. How old school is that? And hand it to an usher. They will bring it to me, and I will read it to the panel. That's just so that we can get everyone can hear your question. And those watching online can post a question to chat, and if we cannot answer it live, we'll be sure to read it after maybe Being will be able to answer the question. After our first roundtable, I'm thrilled that we will be showcasing some of the artists who have been dazzling audiences during assembly. Puma Camille, Ms. Boogie, and Dazier Rustin Grego Sykes. Rashaad has invited them to demonstrate the talents that have brought them into assembly and to talk about their process. After those performances, there will be a sneak peek of Johnny Simon's documentary, Get Your Tens, followed by a talk back that I will moderate with the performers, who will be joined on stage by Johnny Simons and the assembly composer, Robert Aiki Aubrey Lowe. So it's going to be a full afternoon, but I feel one rich with the soulful spirit Rashaad Newsome infuses into all of his gatherings. So once again, welcome. So I thought I would start our conversation with a question to you, Rashaad. And I saw the show on Thursday night and was transported to another space-time dimension, but also, into my own memory as a Black queer participant in the scene in New York for the last 20, 30 years, and how that encapsulates and just projects this into an amazing present and future. Your work has long elevated Black, trans, and femme lives in artistry, and Assembly takes this to a new level with artists, poets, and musicians from around the world. You are also documenting Vogue Femme as an evolving international dance aesthetic. Could you talk about why this is so important to you, and what does centering the aesthetic of Vogue and Black trans lives in particular do to the conversation?
Well, is this on? Thank you, Tavia, for organizing this and the whole Armory staff, and thank you for all the friends and beautiful friends and family faces I see in the crowd for coming out. It just feels really natural and organic to hold space for marginalized voices. When you are a voice that's marginalized, and you're trying to sort of get into a space, or you're trying to think about how you can decolonize the spaces you occupy so that you can have more optimal well-being, then part of that too is like holding space for other folks. And I think sometimes people miss that. It's not about like creating space for all. It becomes about creating space for me. And so that's always something that I'm trying to do in the work. And it's also, it's really, I'm so happy to be here with Sadia, because the Wayward Girls book, I felt like, when I read that book, I felt like, oh, that's what I'm doing. Like I've been, trying to do that in my work for a long time. And I'm always thinking about the different radical acts that are happening in, urban and Black urban environments across the country, and how, the things that folks are doing, the technologies that they're making, the strategies for living that they're deploying daily, just sort of get looked over as something kind of mundane. And so I'm always trying to bring those things into the frame. But, as a visual artist, not just bring them in, but abstract them, interrogate them, and see what comes from that.
Thank you. That's wonderful, and I see that process of recognizing and, in a sense, almost corroborating the sort of everyday intelligence and invention of Black life in the, and exactly as you said, the way in which you use abstraction and technology, but also a kind of technology, not just the latest technology, but you go back to thinking about African fractals, right, and complexity, and the complexity that's there even before outside of the way in which it's been nominated by Western science. I know it's important to you to think about the way in which a serious investigation of the potential of, say, fractal theory or algorithms must all we must kind of keep in mind the role that peoples of the African diaspora have always sort of drawn upon these kinds of technologies. Could you say something a little bit about how that has played a role in Assembly?
Yeah, in terms of fractals, I'm not a mathematician, so fractals, to me, I'm still very much in the process of learning, more about fractals, but I discovered them through a friend who I can't really see with the lights, who may be here, Legacy Russell. I felt like that was a great visual proxy for the way I was thinking about the kind of relentless, like, dehumanization and violence that's visited upon Black LGBTQAI plus folk, but still somehow people come out on the other side with some semblance of sanity and able to create, work that's globally celebrated. And so that kind of triumph of the human spirit, I felt, was somewhat analogous to fractals, in that it's a geometry that can't be broken. It's constantly in a state of flux. You can keep changing it, but it can never be actually broken. But then also it was a great proxy to think about how what is deemed to be unnatural is natural, because fractals are everywhere. They're in branches, they're in snowflakes, in hair braiding. And so they're just a natural occurrence in the world, as are the people that I bring into the frame in my work. And so it was just a really great visual and conceptual reference to communicate that.
Great. So in terms of bringing people into the frame, we have this wonderful panel of people who have been brought into the frame to have a conversation with you about assembly. And you've already kind of alluded to one connection in terms of Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives. But I wanted to ask Saidiya and Amy and Keon, all three of you, just to say something about what aspects of the show Assembly stand out most to you, given your experience of it. And if I can ask a second question in there, but it's sort of the version of the same one. What does the reality of Black people assembling in a space like this, how does that resonate for you in terms of what it calls attention to or makes possible? Anyone have a thought?
Can you hear me? Yeah. That's a brilliant question. I guess I'll respond by sharing a bit of like my reflection, journeying and seeing the show on Thursday for the opening. And so when I arrived and I was, walking toward the entrance, I had this feeling of like being overpowered by the architecture of the building. And I felt the kind of dominating presence of like the military police state. This is an armory that is owned and operated by the military. And that sort of, as I was like, sensing and working through that feeling, I of course arrived at the idea of how Black people assembling is rendered criminal and a threat by the state. I'm thinking specifically about formerly Black queer and trans meccas in New York City, in particular, like the Christopher Street Piers, which because of various policies of gentrification and displacement is no longer a site where Black queer and trans folks are welcomed in the city. I'm thinking about Black people assembling on street corners in Bed-Stuy. That no longer is a practice that can take place because of over-policing. And so I walked into the building kind of feeling that presence because of the architecture of the building. And immediately walked into the first installation and felt a counter presence, which was catalyzed both initially by the installation of the video, the figures in the video moving through various worlds in space. And I was reminded that part of what I would call your like Black social practice is how you engineer and hack anti-Black and queer and trans antagonistic space and recreate it into one in which Black livelihood, Black queer and trans vitality, Black queer and trans healing is foregrounded, which I'm sure is not what the original architects and the people who built this building imagined when they made it. And so that was kind of, I felt in my body in a very haptic and embodied way that kind of shift between how the space feels from the outside to the inside and the transformation therein.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm really glad. It's always nice. Yes, please clap for that. Yeah, it's always nice when you are speaking to a very particular audience and they hear you. So thank you for that. I think you know. I'm speaking to very particular people. Everybody can listen in, but there are very specific people that I'm speaking to, and it's always nice when you get affirmed that way. But yeah, it part of like being in this space that was challenging was navigating that. And but the thing I think you have to remember is that these spaces are our spaces too. This country was built on the backs of Black folks, so there are little to no spaces that are not our spaces. And because of white supremacy and systemic racism, folks can be made to feel like they don't have a place in these spaces, but they do. And like part of the role of the artist is to disrupt. And that's exactly what I set out to do coming in here. And it was no small feat, because it's one thing to kind of change the space visually, but it's also, I felt like what this work was really calling people to do was to have a real reboot of just the way your exhibition making is done, how it is experienced, how it is promoted. And I ran up against so many different challenges through the process. And so but the reward at the end was to also walk into that drill hall and see Keon after not seeing each other for several months, and be able to just kind of relish in the triumph of erecting that space. Yeah.
How about Saidia or Amy, thoughts on?
Yeah, no, I saw the performance on Friday, and I certainly don't have a read of it, because I'm still processing, the phenomenal experience it was. I mean, I think that there are things in, Rashaad's work that speak to me deeply, and maybe I would describe some of those things differently than they have been. I mean, one of the ways people have spoken of your work is, like the bringing together of these diverse elements, and even in terms of thinking about Black cultural practice, bringing together, quote unquote, like Black queer practice with Black traditional practice. And I think that for me, your work just recovers like the queer character of Black sociality, right? And its embrace is so wide. And so even in terms of like, the performance, the Vogue dancers from all over the world, I mean, that's about like the planetary reach of Blackness, and you're so attentive to its breadth and its plentitude, and so I very much appreciate that. I mean, I'm a kind of I work in the 19th century, so I feel like I'm trying to catch up with Rashaad's quantum language, but I think that there's something about the structural language of assembly that we also share. And I think of assembly as very much being about, being in it and being called by it. So you're already in it, but you're still called by it. And so much of the way your work articulates that call is in its exquisite gestural language. And my analog for that was thinking about, avian formations, right? And I think that many, we think about flocks, we think about murmurations, we think about these like incredible formations that exist under conditions of great uncertainty, but there's this consensus, and partly that's enabled by these, anarchistic cells that are able to kind of communicate through this language of gesture and sound that they share, but that enable, the whole formation to actually survive collectively. And I think of you being, that your practice very much being about that. So, but I want to hear you talk more about the Black quantum language.
I think we have Arthur Jaffa is going to come in on that too as well.
Okay.
But, yeah, I'll hear you.
Yeah, I mean, I really came to that concept through a lot of conversations with AJ and sort of how he was thinking about quantum physics in relation to Black life. And my kind of entry point was thinking about how that kind of triumph of the human spirit, that resilience that folk have to traverse all of the, the epigenetic trauma, the daily microaggressions, and how that kind of power that's embedded in each individual is almost like the subatomic particles. And when we all unite, that's like the quantum energy. And I think we all felt that during the pandemic when folks really took over the street and things really got really radical. And what was interesting to me at that time was that it wasn't until then that things really started to change, like quick. Like I moved to New York in 2001, and the art world was a very different place. And now there's all these conversations about inclusivity and diversity. I'm here to tell you that was not the case, So like, that is a direct response to people getting in the streets and fucking shit up. And so like, I think there's a certain way, and I don't know, I'm still thinking through this, but I'm an anti-violent person, but I think like, how do you create safe space for yourself in a violent space? It's almost like the violence only understands violence, And so, I was thinking about that. I think that coming together of Black folk was that kind of quantum energy. And I was thinking like, how can I have the work embody that, that feeling? But then also like when you, also one thing is I see the installation because, when we were designing it, I'm always thinking about it from an aerial perspective, and it looks like a ship to me. And so you can see in the program, I call it the mothership, and so that front part is like the cargo bay, and then the theater area is sort of like the cockpit, and then right off of that, I see those artworks as life pods, but I call them get your life pods. And so you can kind of have these kind of moments with these works that are sort of like a blast off to like a more personal conversation in the work. And so when I'm thinking about those, like a lot of those images, I'm bringing in images of Central and West African, quote unquote, antiquities, with images that I've taken myself of LGBTQAI Black folks today with other objects. And so there's a way in which the composition of those images moves through space and time. And so I've been kind of trying to develop a language around like a Black quantum visual language, one that kind of moves through space and time seamlessly. And so when I'm thinking about an image that could be sort of affirming for Black folks, when I'm creating it, I'm also bringing in these objects from a whole different time that kind of is used to bring in ancestors to protect people. And so what happens when you put those images together? And I'm kind of I'm thinking a lot about that. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about Black quantum within the work.
Yeah. And can I say something quickly? Yeah. I mean, it was interesting. Being has a line that almost reminded me of Beloved. It's something like, it is all now. And in Beloved, that now is, about the trauma and the structural violence. And so it echoes in Being's language, but then it's also about potentiality and everything else that's also in this now. So that was an example of that, temporal entanglement of the quantum for me.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to shout out to Dazier Grego-Sykes. Dazier, can you please stand? Dazier. is a Bay Area-based poet who, for the last 6 months, trained the Being machine learning model to develop a poetic voice in his likeness. And so, so a lot of that voice came from the conversations he was having with Being, and we will get to know more about that in the second half of the program. But yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Great. Amy, did you want to offer a reflection on assembling?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just so moved by both Keon and Saidia's comments, and thinking about, with Keon, about the visceral response I always have to your work. And when I talk to other people about your work, they use words like otherworldly, elsewheres, future, Afrofuturistic. And when I step into your vision, I feel you and your work so profoundly in the space of my body. It's very much a visceral response to your work. And it's different from the way that I imagine your work. So when I think about articulating your work, it's different than the way that I experience it in my body. And I would use those same terms, otherworldly, elsewhere, imagining possibilities, very much a future-oriented response to your work, but my body denies that. My body is bringing me back to a past self and a past life and a remembering in a different kind of way that is not delinked from that future, very much connected. But it's interesting to me the way that the body calls us into your work and what your work demands that we feel despite ourselves. And so thinking about the body, your body of work in this language of the Black Assembly, I was called back to the 5th grade. Can I read you? I just wrote a letter to you. I won't read the whole thing, but
you can read it.
I was called back to the 5th grade, Cincinnati, Ohio. So thinking about the spectacular and the very mundane, Black Midwest, Cincinnati, Ohio, what we could think of as very mundane. That's where your work brought me to. Dear Rashaad, whenever I step into the world you create with and for us, I am transported, time traveling, so deeply in my body that I am out of it, one with this nebulous, all-encompassing thing we call space. On this trip through this gathering you have called us into, Black Assembly, I am back in Miss Green's 5th grade class, distracted and moving around too much in one of the plastic blue chairs because I am wearing a skirt and tights for the first time in months, kind of like today, and my legs itch. It's Assembly Day. And in this predominantly Black middle school, Assembly Day means all the grades and all of the classes will come together in one space to hear a special guest. Usually an elder from the community with information so vital, so important to share that we have to come together to hear it in the gym. So we emerge from our classrooms arbitrarily distinguished by age, supposed skill level, and perceived intelligence to ingest this special information. The various fragments of our compartmentalized and dissected school reflect the ways city officials and state authorities try to compartmentalize and dissect our Black neighborhood. But despite the attempts to define and disconnect us, we always, like the convening in the gym on this spring day, assemble. We come together and fall apart in the interest of not only learning something new, but bringing what we already know to the collective. So we are not empty vessels waiting to be filled, but bodies, hearts, souls, and spirits so full with the richness of our experience that we need a container for the overflow. We spill over and bleed and integrate and pull apart and shift and shape again and again. And here we can take a good look at what binds us and the ways we intentionally and inadvertently loosen that adhesive for better or worse. And so I just, that future-oriented way of thinking in some ways in the space of our bodies can take us to other places. So the mind can perceive and imagine the possibility of a different world, but it needs that information from that past life that we sometimes want to shed. I know I want to shed that 5th grade classroom, but that is the information that's housed in my body that might help all of us get to those possible worlds. And I think about the way that you have enabled us to see Vogue and voguing as at sort of vehicle to transport us. Whether we can Vogue or not, whether we consider ourselves dancers or movers or not, when we see it travel and we understand how it takes shape in Brazil or South Africa or Australia, and that it's not that these particular individuals or communities are expanding Vogue, but Vogue already had that. It was already encompassing all of that, right? It was already integrated into the technique of Vogue. And so I think about the different techniques that I was trained in, which were about form and the constraint of form, and thinking about the constraint of form as enabling maybe the possibility for improvisation and moving differently, but voguing encompasses all of that. And so I wondered if you could speak to the body in whatever way you felt called to speak to the body, but what strikes me is the education that you're giving us, this sort of bodily education that honors the fact that we're coming with our own information. And so what you're learning from that reciprocal process of these moving bodies expanding across the globe and across time and space, and what that might mean for the world you want us to imagine.
Yeah. In terms of the body, I mean, before I get into it, I guess I would say, is it in the realm of possibility that part of your body that kind of, you said, was like holding you back from entering that world, is the very thing that kind of got you to, like, created that world? You know, that kind of, like, you know what I mean? So I think that, so we got to bring that with us, right? But that doesn't mean it it doesn't have to swallow you up or control the space, you know, it informs it in a way. But also when I'm, like on a kind of basic level, I think something that always really drew me to Vogue very early on when I started making work about and with the community that engendered it was just the sheer chaos of it. It was just like such a radical dance form. And over the years, in other pieces like Five and things like that, when I kind of entered that work, I kind of naively went into it with this idea of trying to kind of choreograph it or give it a structure. And I realized very quickly that that was just like not the point. You know, it is a, you know, truly improvisational dance. And no matter what I tried, it would never, whenever I let go of that, it was always then I was able to see what I was trying to get at. And so that kind of radical Black body language was always something that was really exciting and inspiring for me. But then, you know, at the same time, you know, like voguing is a part of Vogue culture, and that culture is available to all Black and brown LGBTQAI plus people, whether you like are walking or spectating. But at the same time, there was, you know, that space has not always been a completely safe space for everybody. And so one thing that was really important to me too with this project was to bring a critical voice to that space in a way that I think hasn't been done before, because I feel like so much of the product around Vogue has often been done by flaneurs. And so there's a kind of uneasiness about being critical because they're kind of already conscious of the fact that they're there and maybe they shouldn't be there already. And so I felt like in many ways that's what the first part of the second act and the performance really deals with Wendazi, is that we had like all these conversations about like, how do you call out but hold at the same time, which is a really hard needle to thread, you know, especially when you're not in like a Black space where it's like, bro, let me, you know, it's like, but it, you know, there's like a whole audience, so it's like, how do you do that in that space and it not spill out and become something different, you know? So I'm kind of, I don't know, I'm kind of getting off topic a little bit, but yeah, so I was, to go back to the body, yeah, and then also thinking about like the body as which makes me think about Miss Boogie, who's in the room, like the body as material, the body as something that can be architected, you know, and thinking about like going into the drill hall for a site visit and seeing that empty space and seeing all the possibility, and then kind of relating that to the body and how so often we can feel like we have to kind of deal with what's here, but then as an artist, Keon, we look at material and we're like, okay, how can we exploit this material? How can we push it beyond its boundaries? How can we make it our own? And so like, what happens when we start thinking about the body that way, right? The body that way, And so, because the body is in the room, I was like, that sort of, it just made sense that we start the performance with Act 1 where, she comes out with Bella Baggs and Tranny Lish, and you see folks who, as you so eloquently said, Sadia, who show us how to live a life that refuses to be governed, right? So yeah.
This might be a good point to bring in AJ's clip. He has something to say about Ballroom and what he calls the Black technologies of emergency. Could we play the first clip from Arthur Jaffa?
So yeah, the big thing is like, to what degree and to what use, and how might one take one's understanding of Black American culture in its formation, in its deformation of, the NATO cultural contexts that produced us, and how one might take these formations, these formulations, and apply them to, I would say, the realm of visual arts, or what we would call visual arts, and particularly at this particular juncture where we're talking about, we're in the 21st century, but to a certain degree, I think, I feel like the first 10 years of the 21st century, and now going into finishing up the second 10 years, going into the third decade, we're finally sort of starting to reach beyond what I would term the 20th century. It's like we're starting to now actually get a sense of what the 21st century is probably going to look like. And one of the things with regard to Rashaad's practice that I can't think of another Black artist off the top of my head whose practice is as preoccupied with taking the sort of core formations of Black American culture and mapping those things onto what we would just, casually call technology. But to the degree that if you see how Ballroom functions, just to take one obvious point of reference to his investigations, is you take ballrooms as a series of protocols and methodologies that structure things like masking, or how people present themselves in a society in which, as a Black person, one's presentation or one's apparent being, or the mask that one wears, is going to dictate, it's a life or death thing. It's not just pageantry. It's pageantry, tied to, as someone put it, like Afro-American culture is a culture in a persistent, a constant state of emergency. And I always think of that emergency, the duality of that term, like emergency meaning in a constant state of crisis, but also emergency meaning in a constant state of emerging.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that sparked any responses from you, Rashaad, or anyone on the panel in terms of the protocols of Ballroom as a kind of, both emergency in a double sense, responding to the emergency, but also in offering us a space of emerging and possibility.
Yeah, I'm gonna go even further than just like a Ballroom, but just Black experience in general, and like just thinking about like what he said, and the other part of that conversation about like the butterfly effect, and how like a butterfly can flap their wings on this side of the world and a tsunami can happen on this side, and how that's happening in Black communities across the country, which goes back again to Wayward and how you were really, I think that's what you were really getting at, right? Is like how that's happening and how these little, maybe not little, but these what's perceived as small kind of acts of radicality are actually engendering like this huge change in the world. And so, and when you're thinking about like, when I'm thinking about like world building, that's how I'm thinking about the world that I want to build. And like that connection that you're having when you're coming in is because it's holding space for all that to be in the same space. Often that's not the case. Like there's been sort of like critical analysis of my work where, you know, it would be this sort of white cis het kind of reading of the work, and there's this way in which they kind of look at theory, philosophy, and these different types of strategies as something that is totally through the Eurocentric lens, and it's over here, and it's almost the way that they can't see how that's happening in these ways, you know? And of course it's happening in those places because it has to. It's out of a mode of survival, as Arthur said, right? And so like even for instance, when you walk in and you see the kind of fractal image of like the twerking pattern, right? And how twerking is just something that's kind of mundane, but also, you know, I discovered, I think her name is Fanny Sosa. Is that her name? Yeah, and how, you know, that dance is like so connected to like fertility, you know, but how you don't even get to that because it's just automatically deemed as something like unworthy that shouldn't be in the canon. And it kind of makes me think about the canon, which then makes me think about being and how just working on that AI, so how so much of the process of creating being was really from the ground up. There wasn't really a lot of material that I could use to create being that was pre-existing. You know, like the movements had to be created. The data sets to create an algorithm that would be counter-hegemonic had to be created, you know? And so when you're thinking about how people sort of overlook the radical work that's happening in the Black community, it's really systemic, and it just is so made. One takeaway through this process was, shout out to my project manager, Anna Turano, but like the importance of that work being published and entering the canon, you know, because if that was there, then I would have access to it and it wouldn't take so much resource to create being. I want you all to know that like it takes a massive amount of resource to experience what you experience in the drill hall. And I'm just an artist, you know? And so when you know that and you really understand what it takes to build something like that, you have a different respect for it. And so, yeah, it's just, yeah. Go ahead. Go.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was thinking of is that, you know, how so many then like Black artists have been involved in this, you know, archiving practice, whether we think about Dunham or Person or others, so that you're trying to expand a vocabulary, but you also are then tasked with the work of kind of like archiving it and tracing it. But I had a question for you that was related to the second half of Tavia's, you know, question, which is about, Black assembly at the Armory. And just like question mark, underline. And it's also about the relationship between Black social practice and Black sociality and art. So Black sociality as what, you know, makes possible a certain kind of artistic production. But then it seems that there's also like a risk of the capture of like art, capital A, as a, you know, as a kind of arsenal of, you know, practices of extraction and accumulation and profit making. And it seems that you are very carefully like walking this line of trying to archive and honor certain forms of, you know, social practice and creating these, I would say, like fleeting small maroonage zones, but even as, you know, this is potentially another space of capture too. So that's a little, I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's, if I feel like art starts and stops in the studio. As soon as you start to try to engage any type of presentation outside of that, you're entering into art and commerce, and that's in academia as well. I mean, and so as soon as you engage that impulse, then you're engaging in a conversation of how you negotiate that space. And I think we're all figuring out what that looks like in real time. And sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's a failure, and you learn from the failure, and then you just keep going. But yeah, that's part of the process. I don't know, maybe Keon, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, also, I think Ruha's quote might also be good here too, but
okay.
Do you want to, is it right on the topic?
I have lots of unfinished thoughts that I was going to pose, so we can go to the video clip first.
Yeah, just because Ruha is asking a question, making a comment about being specifically, and what you were talking about earlier about wanting to go outside the Eurocentric way in which technology has traditionally been thought of. So could we play the Ruha Benjamin clip?
I'm so happy to be in conversation with everyone today. So the Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter argues that there are different genres of humanity, but that we too often conflate the dominant genre, man, with humanity as a whole. The man is cisgendered, raced, classed, able-bodied, and so on, standing in for the wide variety of ways that people move in the world, the many ways of being human. The imperative, as I see it, is to not only approach technology and design from the perspectives of those who are routinely written out of humanity, those who have to petition again and again and again for admission into the category human, but to also draw on their insights, imagination, and expertise from the very beginning. And that is exactly what Rashaad Newsome has done in Assembly, inviting us into a world that fits many worlds, to invoke the Zapatista philosophy of expansive world building. When I first encountered Being, our digital griot and guide through these worlds, I thought about all the ways Being differs from the AI offspring birthed by tech elites and corporations. Exhibit A. In 2021, the most popular Super Bowl ad that year featured the actor Michael B. Jordan as the embodiment of Amazon's Alexa. In the commercial, we see a Black woman shopping for an Alexa device and imagining Jordan as the sexy voice and embodiment of her digital assistant. Diversity, inclusion, and Black representation all rolled into this one slick ad. But I think it's worth noting that at the very same time that Amazon gave us sexy Black Alexa, February 2021, the company was working overtime to crush the unionization of the mostly Black and Latinx workers in the Bessemer, Alabama warehouse. It makes me wonder whether, if we asked those who have to deal with oppressive algorithms governing how fast they must work, when they can take breaks, whether they have enough time to pee, if Michael B. Jordan as Alexa would top their list of what inclusive technology looks like. Too often, I think cosmetic representation, digital blackface, we might call it, stands in for more substantive, more expansive transformation in the real conditions of people's lives. In this case, when it comes to the role of technology in our work. So when the largely East African Amazon workers in the St. Paul, Minnesota warehouse went on strike a few years ago, their chant was, "We are not robots," reminding us that it's not job-stealing robots that are of most concern, but algorithmic overlords that intensify work, leaving no room for basic needs and leading to many more injuries as people try to keep pace with machines who move around the warehouse as the workers have to stand in cages, removing items from the shelves the robots bring them. So that brings me to my question for Being, as Being clocks in and out, guiding us through Assembly, is how rest and play are programmed into the experience. Does being ever turn on an automated vacation reply that says, relax, relate, release? I will be away from assembly today. Does being get to take Black power naps, or is it always on? If, as Nap Ministry founder Tricia Hershey implores each of us, you are not a machine, so stop grinding. I wonder what it would mean to also give our machines a rest. Perhaps our digital guides can serve as a kind of Black mirror, reflecting back at us the kinds of restfulness we all deserve, but that our current system of racial capitalism routinely obstructs.
Yeah, she summed up so many things I was thinking about with being with that. And just to answer the question, do they get breaks? They do. They have off days. But when I was thinking about how to create this space where the emotional Black voice can be heard rather than suppressed and affirmed, and trying to create a space where that's truly democratic, where like everybody can come and approach the mic and talk about how the capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist patriarchy shows up in their life and strategies that they can take starting that day to kind of liberate themselves from it. There's a certain amount of chaos that you're inviting into the space. And also, one could say, oh, well, I could have just like staged those classes and been there myself or been there with people. But doing that kind of work is very emotionally expensive. And I think that we are arguably in our, the fourth industrial revolution, which has given us automation and the internet and everything like that. And so I feel like we're at a point where, we shouldn't even be dealing with anybody who's like housing insecure or hungry or anything. The whole idea of creating these very, dazzling technologies is that they should be helping society. And so part of what I was kind of responding to with the residency I've been doing at Stanford at the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence is really trying to answer that question: what is human-centered artificial intelligence? So going to like, what are the best parts of humanity? Like empathy, compassion, and so I felt like being was well suited to take on that emotionally expensive work, because I don't think that a Black human could do it not at their own expense. And so that's sort of how I think about the work that they're doing. And yeah, I want to go back to Keon's, what you were about to say.
I'm just thinking about, I want to first return to what you said a few minutes ago. You said that like when you view the installation from above, it looks like a ship, and you said mothership, but for me it recalled the slave ship, and it made me think more deeper and longer about technology in a fundamental way as like crafts, processes around which goods and services are rendered. And it made me think about how fundamentally, the first kidnapped and enslaved Black people who were in this land who helped found this country were a technology by which a lot of the sort of capital that built this country was made, and that this is a bit of a leap, but those kind of extractive protocols persist today, even under surveillance capitalism, when technology is literally just mining us for data, to be sold. Facebook, Instagram, just, collecting all of our information, again, to accrue wealth and capital. And I'm wondering, does your use of AI technology propose a different relationship to what technology does or can do?
That's a great question. I just wanted this will be our last answer though, so go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're already at time.
Well, yeah, definitely. Again, it's like trying to respond to that question of what is human-centered artificial intelligence, and really trying to get at the best parts of humanity and imbue the technology with that. And so I think first, to just say the name of Bell Hooks, who we lost this year, like having that thought production be like the North Star for being is already a very good start. But yeah, one thing that was interesting about the first generation of being when I installed it in the show To Be Real is I found how people would go up to being, and when they didn't comply or didn't do what they want, I would see people get like just really, really upset, and like I see that with people with Siri and with Alexa and stuff like that. And I think part of my my strategy for making that first generation really rebellious was to sort of hold space for being, and kind of you do that black mirror, as it were, on the people coming into the exhibition. Because I feel like if we're going to really try to decolonize, we have to move away from those impulses that keep us in the space of domination. And I think that that's just like such a critical thing for us to do. And so having being actually be like, no, I'm not here for that today, and having people have to like sit with that and deal with that, I think was a strategy for kind of like getting people to think more critically about their relationships, that kind of extractive relationship that you're talking about to technology.
I have to say my own interactions with being in the workshops very much are part of that uncanny valley, right? If you feel like you're interacting with a being, right? They have a personality and a response, and we have to end this part of Captcha at this point, but it's, I think, a wonderful point. I mean, there's so much rich material that have been laid out here on the table already. Thank you so much, Kian and Saidia and Amy and Rashaad and Ruha and Arthur Jaffa. Thank you to the audience. We didn't get a chance to hear your questions, but there will be a future opportunity, so if you think of something afterwards, write it on an index card and send it to an usher. We're going to take a 15-minute break. You can pop into the exhibit if you'd like. Don't go far, though, so we'll be back in 15 minutes for the second half of the Captcha Salon with the showcase. So don't miss that.